A few years ago, I was having tea with a scholar in a quiet high-rise office in Seoul, and he gestured toward the window to the orderly rows of commuters and the hum of the city below, and he told me with just absolute certainty, we are immune to the chaos you see in the West. He said, our culture values the group. We don't have room for the angry mob or the populist demagogue. And, it's a story we've all been told in one way or another. This idea that East Asia has a sort of collectivist gene that acts like a natural antibody, shielding it from the political fires we see burning through Europe and America. And it sounds plausible. It's even comforting in a way. It paints this picture of a society where the smartest guys in the room are in charge and everyone else is kind of content to let them get on with it. And for a while, if you look at the polite surface of Tokyo or the high-tech stability of Beijing, you might actually believe it. But then the mask slips. I remember watching that exact same harmonious Seoul just transform. It became a literal river of light, millions of people on the streets. And not for a festival, but to systematically, piece by piece, dismantle a presidency. And more recently, in December 2024, the world just watched, completely stunned, as a South Korean president declared martial law. It was this desperate grab for power, and it was met by a unanimous impeachment that felt less like a legal process and more like a political exorcism. Even in Japan, the supposed island of calm, I've seen the ruling party deploy assassin candidates just to publicly execute the careers of their own members. It's a kind of theatrical aggression that would make a Western populist blush. And that instantaneous shift from this deep-seated deference to authority to a total explosive rejection of the elite, that is the real story of East Asia today. It turns out that collectivism isn't a vaccine against populism at all. In a lot of ways, it's the perfect petri dish. So the real question is, if it isn't some ancient philosophy keeping the peace, what is actually holding these societies together? And why does their so-called antibody keep failing so spectacularly?
That is the essential conundrum, isn't it? It's the difference between this plausible cultural explanation, the idea of a generalized collectivism, and the actual institutional reality. Mm-hmm. We really need to move past that vague notion of Asian values. The presumed immunity you just described, that stability. It's not derived from simple cultural conformity.
So if collectivism is too broad, how do we define the real social contract? What's the genuine foundation holding it all together and, sometimes letting it collapse?
Well, it's far more specific.
Yeah.
And it's deeply, deeply rooted in history. It's a long tradition of Confucian elitism paired with a hyper-focused meritocratic governance.
Okay, so meritocracy is the key.
It's the absolute key. Yeah. The underlying contract, and this has endured for centuries across the whole region, is basically this. The elites, the modern successors to the old scholar officials, they promise stability, they promise wealth, and most importantly, wise and moral governance. And in return, the people grant their trust and their deference. The legitimacy of the entire system, the whole thing, rests on the intellectual and moral capability of these vetted, educated elites.
So populism, then, is...
It's the violent, often instantaneous rejection of that contract. It happens when the competence or the morality of the elite is exposed as a lie.
That reframes the entire conflict for me. Because in the West, populist movements often challenge the system itself, right? They claim the elite rigged the game or that democracy is broken. But here, the populist fire is fueled by realizing that the elite, who supposedly earned their spot through all this intellectual rigor,
are either incompetent or corrupt or both.
It's a fundamental betrayal of the deepest societal bedrock, a belief in intellectual superiority as a guarantee of good governance.
That's the core insight. It's an internal combustion. It's based on disappointment, not just, structural grievance. And to really feel the weight of that elite bargain, you have to look at the process that selected those leaders for over 1,000 years. We have to start with the original meritocracy, the imperial examinations.
The ultimate system for filtering intellectual talent, it's still studied globally as this incredible feat of institutional design.
Oh, absolutely. The idea of choosing government administrators on merit over birth, that started pretty early in China. But the systematic implementation, that began during the Tang Dynasty in the 7th century. And that was a massive institutional shift. The process really blossomed during the Song Dynasty. It created a standardized 3-tiered structure of competition that was, in theory at least, open to almost everyone. It established a clear path from a local village scholar all the way up to an imperial court minister.
And the sheer longevity of it is just, it's hard to get your head around. It lasted for 1,300 years.
It did.
That tells you something about its power to legitimize the entire state.
It speaks to its remarkable function, doesn't it? It wasn't abolished until 1905. And as we noted, its principles, they still underpin modern civil service entry in China and Taiwan. And its influence is felt worldwide. The system served two really critical functions. First, it ensured a common culture. Every single official had to share this deep knowledge of the Chinese classics, of history, of literary style.
Which you would need to unify an empire that diverse.
Exactly. And second, and this is crucial, the ideal of achievement based purely on intellectual merit gave profound legitimacy to imperial rule. It was a necessary counterbalance to the power of hereditary aristocrats and military commanders. Anyone who successfully climbed that ladder, well, they'd earned their place through intellectual fire.
And climbing that ladder was no small thing. This wasn't just a test. It was a societal commitment, right?
Right.
Oh, absolutely. During the later dynasties, like the Ming and Qing, the system became this arduous ladder of success. You had multiple rounds, the local exam, then the provincial exam, and finally the metropolitan exam in the capital. And these were held over several days, often in these tiny, isolated cells. The highest degree was the jinshi, which is sort of like an advanced scholar.
Similar to a modern PhD, maybe?
Roughly, yes. And getting that jinshi was mandatory for the highest government positions. The examination hall itself was often a site of, physical and mental breakdown.
But when we talk about social mobility, that's where the system really delivered. It genuinely allowed people without an aristocratic background to reach the pinnacle of power. That would have been completely impossible in, say, contemporary European feudal systems.
The statistics are really compelling. We have historical data from the Song dynasty that shows roughly 57% of successful degree holders came from families that had held no official rank for the three preceding generations.
Wow.
So this was a system that told every ambitious young man, even if his family wasn't wealthy, that if he had the capacity, the dedication, the patience, the highest office was, in theory, open to him.
And that creates a kind of political stability dividend, I'd imagine.
It does. Why revolt against the emperor when your son could potentially be his highest minister?
And the model spread. It wasn't just in China.
No, we see it copied across East Asia. In Korea, they called it the Guajio, and it was adopted in Japan and Vietnam too. But the influence didn't stop there.
Right.
Not at all. Its greatest global impact actually came much later. This systematic, standardized, competitive exam model was adopted by the British East India Company in the mid-19th century, and later, around 1855, by the British government for their entire civil service. It provided a clear, non-corrupt method for screening competence.
And from there,
It eventually became the blueprint for modern bureaucratic hiring across the developed world, including France and the United States. It's really impossible to understand modern government efficiency without tracing its roots back to ancient China.
which brings us directly into the 21st century. The legacy of the jinshi isn't gone. It just morphs into a modern context. And it creates this immense burden on those who pursue this path today.
Yes, and this is where we need to introduce the story of Minji. She's a young woman we encounter studying for the South Korean civil service examinations. And she is physically isolated, living in what's called a Gosewan study room in Seoul.
For anyone who's not familiar, a goswan is. It's basically a tiny cell-like room, barely big enough for a bed and a desk, and they're often located near these big test prep institutes. It's total immersion.
Precisely. And Minji's decision to pursue a high-stakes government post is the modern version of that scholar official tradition. This is so much more than a job application. It's a modern rite of passage. It's a heavy, heavy burden. She's expected to be technically brilliant, of course, but also to embody the ideal of the junzi, the superior person, meaning she must be morally upright, unbiased, a guardian of the public interest.
That moral dimension is so key to understanding the difference here. If Minji is seen as succeeding technically, but failing morally, if she's corrupt, that's a total societal failure.
It's catastrophic. Because the pressure on her and her peers is just enormous. In South Korea, educational success is almost entirely synonymous with socioeconomic status. And this drives the relentless, high-stakes exam culture and the huge private tuition market, the Hakwon system.
The Hakwon system.
We are talking about families dedicating up to 20% of their total household income to this, investing everything in the promise of the meritocracy.
So the family is buying into that contract. If we pay, and she studies her heart out, society will deliver on the promise of good governance and prosperity.
Correct. And the grueling nature of this vetting process is actually the source of the high-trust society. The public, traditionally, trusts the competence of their leaders because they know they've been vetted through this extreme intellectual and financial gauntlet. The societal dream is to be governed by the most capable minds, and that belief, it acts as a massive bulwark against crude anti-intellectualism.
But
the moment that trust collapses, the instability that results is far more explosive because the entire premise of the state's legitimacy is broken.
okay, let's unpack that framework, the idea of meritocratic legitimacy. And our first case study has to be China, right? It's the most powerful example of a state that defines its legitimacy almost entirely through continuous delivery. We often hear there's no visible populism in China, but you argue this is because of political architecture, not culture.
Right. The essential point about China is that the lack of visible, disruptive populist parties is an institutional achievement. It's born of strict centralized control. The Communist Party of China maintains an absolute monopoly on power. Any independent grassroots mobilization, any assembly that claims to represent the pure, uncontrolled people's will, is immediately identified as a fundamental threat to stability.
And they meet it with a kill-it-in-the-cradle approach.
They do. The government, informed by extremely sophisticated social science and surveillance, is hyper-effective at ensuring stability is the paramount outcome.
So, if they're suppressing the typical outlets for popular anger, how do they sustain that Confucian contract? How do they justify their legitimacy without, say, popular elections?
The entire state machinery runs on what we define as performance legitimacy. The CPC understands that the people's deference is conditional. They have to continually accomplish concrete, pragmatic, and measurable goals to retain that popular support. Legitimacy isn't inherited or divine. It's earned every single day through results.
And this strategy translates into tangible results that change the lives of ordinary citizens. It makes the political philosophy feel real.
It absolutely does. This is where the story of the fruit farmer, Lao Wang, in inland China, becomes so instructive. For generations, his life was defined by the physical struggle of getting his produce to market.
Okay.
He spent years hauling heavy crates of oranges down these narrow, muddy paths to a tiny local market that barely sustained his family. The state was a distant, abstract entity, a tax collector maybe, but not much more.
And then the infrastructure changed everything.
Exactly. When the high-speed rail line and the new expressway finally carved their way through those remote mountains, it was more than just a government project. To Lao Wang, it felt like a silent vow finally being kept. He didn't need a lecture on political theory or the latest party resolution. He understood performance-based legitimacy through the tangible reality of the smooth asphalt.
The reduced travel time, the expanded horizon.
Exactly. The state transformed from an abstract burden to a pragmatic, powerful provider.
The state becomes the solution to real-world problems. And that feeling, the smooth asphalt, that's the core of China's modern political philosophy.
It is. Public trust in the government is explicitly earned through the relentless, pragmatic delivery of economic growth, massive infrastructure development, and social stability. And, of course, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty. The modern Confucian social contract is realized through these outcomes. The government's ability to consistently deliver a higher quality of life is the primary metric for its political survival.
But that sounds incredibly demanding for a government. I mean, if the contract is based solely on performance, doesn't that make the state inherently vulnerable to economic downturns or, say, natural disasters?
That is where the historical continuity of the concept comes in. The idea of performance-based legitimacy is ancient. It traces back to the 11th century BC with the Zhou dynasty's invocation of the Mandate of Heaven, or Tiananmen.
A mandate of heaven.
Right, and the mandate grants the ruler, the son of heaven, the right to rule, but, and this is the key, that right is conditional. It requires just governance and critically efficient performance.
So the mandate is tied directly to the state's ability to maintain prosperity and order.
Precisely. If the ruler is seen as unjust, corrupt, or incompetent, and the kingdom experiences social unrest, famine, major natural disasters, these events are interpreted as cosmic signals that the ruler has lost the mandate.
And the right to rule is forfeited.
It is. This concept fundamentally institutionalized the idea that legitimacy is earned, not just inherited.
Later dynasties shifted the focus a bit, right? From purely moral justice toward more comprehensive strength, military, economic.
They did, but the principle remains. Failure to deliver results justifies a change in leadership. And the modern CPC has strategically applied this ancient logic. Post-1978, the regime explicitly linked its rule to economic performance and the survival and rise of China as a global power. They frame all dissent or challenge as a direct threat to national stability itself.
Basically suggesting that internal chaos would immediately jeopardize the economic gains that have improved the lives of people like Lao Wang.
Exactly. The stability dividend is a key focus.
And the consolidation of power at the top seems designed to reinforce this indispensable role of the party.
You see it with the elevation of Xi Jinping thought in the Constitution. The notion that the paramount leader is essential to maintaining peace and order strategically reinforces that historical role of the Son of Heaven, the indispensable figure responsible for the nation's fate and stability.
It strengthens the idea that the nation's success is tied to the party's uninterrupted stewardship.
And its long-term planning, yes.
But people still have grievances. They still see local corruption or feel economic pressures. How does the state manage that inherent populist energy, the anger against a failing elite, without letting it turn into a real political movement?
This is the really ingenious adaptation. The state acts as the sole manager of the people's will. So instead of just suppressing the anger, that standard people versus elite dynamic, the state actively redirects that energy. It channels it into potent, controlled nationalism. This serves to unify the population behind the party as the ultimate defender of the nation.
So the populist energy is outsourced. The enemy is always external, never internal.
That's the pattern. When you see state-sanctioned boycotts of foreign brands, like, for example, H&M back in 2021, the focus immediately shifts. The narrative isn't about public grievances with a corrupt local official or a stalled pension plan. It's about China defending its national honor against a hostile outside world. This mechanism reinforces the party as the nation's sole effective defender, and it builds internal unity. It's a method for draining the swamp where genuine internal populism might grow.
By consistently solving the domestic problems that would fuel it.
And skillfully redirecting any residual frustration outwards. It is a highly pragmatic and effective strategy for long-term stability.
Let's pivot now to Japan, which offers a completely different model. It appears globally as the epitome of quiet political stability. It leads many to believe it's the most immune to populism. But just like China, you're suggesting that stability is an institutional and architectural achievement, not a cultural accident.
Yes, exactly. Japan operates as a massive structural shock absorber. It's primarily designed to exhaust populist energy. Its stability is the result of these deeply embedded institutional arrangements, not just, politeness or deference. And we see two key structural factors at work here that insulate it from radical political swings.
Let's look at the first one, the iron cage, the civil service. This seems to be the quiet center of power, totally independent of election cycles.
It is the permanent government, the modern scholar official class. Think about Sato-san, a career bureaucrat working in the government district of Kasumigaseki in Tokyo. While global politics are raging with volatility and short-term crises, Sato-san is focused on drafting a complex 20-year energy resilience plan. This elite class of unelected civil servants, who are typically graduates of the most prestigious universities, especially the University of Tokyo, they hold immense, often unseen power.
They are the policy executors, the drafters, the institutional memory. How do they act as a brake on radical ideas?
Well, they draft nearly all legislation. They run the government ministries with incredible autonomy. They ensure profound policy continuity, regardless of which politician is currently serving as prime minister. So any radical populist agenda that emerges from the political sphere, it hits this iron cage.
And they slow it down.
The bureaucrats use procedure expertise and institutional inertia to dilute, delay, or just absorb radical ideas. They transform revolutionary promises into incremental, manageable policy changes. The politician promises change, but the bureaucracy delivers refinement.
And the public trusts them. Why? Because of that deep-rooted meritocratic selection.
Exactly. Their legitimacy isn't from elections. It's from the deeply ingrained perception that they represent the nonpartisan national interest. And this trust stems directly from the rigor of their selection through notoriously difficult exams and their university prestige. It's a legacy of strong public administration that far predates the Second World War. They're seen as unbiased national caretakers, ensuring that policy is rational and fair.
And that structural stability is then complemented by the decades-long dominance of the ruling party, the Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP. How does a party stay in power for almost 70 years without becoming a target for populist rage?
The LDP's longevity is not a sign of monolithic unity. It's actually a brilliant example of successful internalized pluralism. The LDP functions fundamentally as a collection of powerful, often competing internal factions.
Okay.
And these factions, they can be based on policy or ideology or just personal loyalty. They represent a wide spectrum of views, from old guard conservatives to more pragmatic reformers.
So the competition that might tear other parties apart is just contained within the LDP structure.
It acts as an internal shock absorber. To get any major policy goal passed, especially on sensitive issues like budgets or taxes, the factions have to bargain. They have to build broad consensus among themselves.
So it forces compromise before the policy even reaches the public.
Right. Discontent, instead of exploding publicly into a separate party, is absorbed and negotiated internally. By the time a policy is enacted, it's often this diluted centrist compromise, which minimizes any kind of radical opposition.
What's the mechanism that prevents the prime minister from just ignoring these internal factions and pushing their own agenda?
You have to look at the Policy Research Council, the PRC. It's this powerful party organ dominated by backbenchers and faction leaders, and it holds immense influence. It functions as a powerful near-veto body against the prime minister's unilateral decisions.
So they can block things.
They review and often rewrite policy proposals before they can even be submitted to the Diet. The bureaucrats in Kasumigaseki often act as technical mediators in this internal competition, lending their expertise to help factions find common, practical ground. The whole system ensures that individual charisma rarely overrides institutional consensus.
And yet, Japan has had its charismatic, outsider-type politicians. Most famously, former Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi in the early 2000s. He managed to tap into popular frustration. How did the system manage that?
Koizumi is the perfect example of Japanese-style populism. It wasn't about fundamentally destroying the LDP. It was about staging political theater within the system in order to reform it. Koizumi expertly positioned himself as a disruptive outsider, determined to smash the old guard. He branded his internal LDP opponents, who resisted his privatization efforts, as the forces of resistance.
And that's where the infamous assassin candidates come in.
Exactly. When his signature postal privatization bill was defeated in the upper house by LDP rebels, he didn't resign quietly. He dissolved the lower house, called a snap election, expelled the rebels, and ran these celebrity, media-savvy assassin candidates against those expelled members in their own districts. It was a controlled, dramatic explosion. It was designed to let off popular steam and project a decisive image of reform, all without fundamentally blowing up the LDP apparatus. The system allowed the theater of populism to drive internal change, reinforcing the idea that the LDP, despite its age, was still capable of reforming itself.
Which, in the end, ensures the stability remains structural, not accidental. Okay, now we cross to South Korea, and the entire calculus just flips on its head. If China manages populism and Japan exhausts it, South Korea seems determined to weaponize it. The idea of cultural immunity completely falls apart here.
South Korea is arguably the most volatile political system in East Asia. It's the definitive counter-argument to the collectivist myth. It's a political volcano. And the core reason for this volatility lies in its history. Its modern democracy was hard-won. It was established through decades of mass opposition to military dictatorships. And this history gave mass street demonstrations, or plaza politics, a profound, almost sacred legitimacy.
A legitimacy that's often considered superior to the formal, messy parliamentary process. When the system fails, they revert to the method that won them democracy in the first place.
Precisely. We saw this in 2016 during the candlelight protests, where millions took to the streets to peacefully demand the impeachment and removal of a sitting president. And the participants, they didn't see these gatherings as mere protests. They often described them as a peaceful festival to demand justice. This demonstrates a successful, deeply ingrained tradition of presidential toppling. It gives the populace a direct and powerful mechanism for accountability that can bypass formal checks and balances.
And that volatility is then amplified exponentially by the unique structure of the executive office, the imperial presidency.
It's a structurally flawed design. You have an office that holds immense, almost unchecked power appointments, control over state prosecutors, vast administrative authority, but it's coupled with a strict single 5-year term limit. And that combination creates an incredibly brutal, winner-take-all political culture. There's zero incentive for long-term compromise or accountability through re-election.
Which guarantees the cycle of revenge. The president is untouchable for 5 years, but the moment they leave office, they become a target.
It leads to what we call the constant political exorcism cycle. Because the stakes are so high, nearly every former president in the Democratic era has faced criminal investigation and often imprisonment. We've seen this with Park Geun-hye, Lee Myung-bak, and the recent high-stakes unanimous impeachment of Yoon Suk-yeol in April 2025.
So the establishment.
The establishment, facing this cutthroat environment, doesn't suppress populism. They use it as a weapon against their rivals. Politicians appeal directly to the people, framing opponents not just as rivals, but as corrupt enemies of the nation, attacking specific institutions like the judiciary or the massive corporate conglomerates, the cabal.
Right, let's define the cabal for our listeners because their sheer size and influence are often central to the populist grievance.
The cabal are the massive, family-controlled industrial conglomerates. So you're thinking Samsung, Hyundai, LG. They're instrumental in South Korea's rapid post-war economic development, but they concentrate enormous wealth and political power in the hands of just a few families.
So when a politician attacks the cabal or calls for corporate reform, they are immediately tapping into this deep populist resentment.
Exactly. Resentment against an elite that is perceived as having rigged the economy through corrupt relationships with the government.
So the populist rhetoric is highly effective because the structural inequality is so profound. Let's circle back to the foundation we established, meritocracy. South Korea is arguably where the rigor of that Confucian-influenced meritocratic system is most intensely felt today.
And this is where the system shows its most profound contradictions. The immense pressure to succeed means that high-ranking government and management posts are heavily dominated by graduates of the SKY universities, Seoul National University, Korea University, and Yonsei University, the top three. The pressure Minji feels in her Gosuwon is societal.
So the system is designed for maximum excellence, yet it produces maximum populist anger. How does that happen?
It's because the system creates structural limits on social mobility. Access to this elite track is incredibly costly and dependent on navigating the expensive Hawkwon system. And furthermore, despite this massive national investment in education, the process is often criticized for focusing too heavily on rote learning and exam performance.
So it doesn't prepare them for the real world.
It often fails to equip the highly educated youth with the adaptive skills needed for the modern knowledge economy, and that leads to persistently high youth unemployment.
So the very system designed to vet the best and brightest ends up creating a closed, privileged class that just fuels the resentment of those who failed to get in.
That is the tragic irony. The meritocracy, designed to prevent hereditary aristocracy and ensure competence, instead generates a new form of rigid elitism. The people who were theoretically vetted to be the best are now perceived by the frustrated majority as a closed class, succeeding in a rigged, high-cost, high-stakes game. The system creates the moral instability it was designed to prevent, making South Korea the perfect example of how the betrayal of the meritocratic contract fused that political volcano.
So the idea that East Asia is immune because of culture is clearly far too simple. What we've seen are three distinct, hyper-sophisticated political systems, and they've each developed unique state-centered ways to manage, absorb, or exploit that people versus elite conflict.
That is the essential takeaway. When we look across China, Japan, and South Korea, we're witnessing a dynamic contest of systems. They all share the foundational legacy of the strong meritocratic state, but their mechanisms for channeling populist energy vary drastically.
Right. Japan gives us the model designed to exhaust populism. The powerful bureaucracy and the LDP's internal consensus mechanisms just dilute radical energy into harmless, incremental change.
China represents the highly pragmatic model designed to manage and redirect populist energy. The state machine maintains stability through strict political control and channels grassroots anger into potent, unifying nationalism.
All while securing public support through relentless performance, legitimacy, and visible results.
And then South Korea showcases the system designed to burn populism as fuel. A hyper-competitive political cycle where the immense power of the executive ensures perpetual political warfare, with both sides continuously leveraging mass appeals and anti-elite rhetoric just to survive the 5-year gauntlet.
So the defining feature across all three is that stability is a function of a strong state tradition and a pragmatic, sometimes brutal, focus on results.
The real struggle, then, isn't about avoiding the people versus elite conflict, because that's universal. It's really about whether the legacy of the scholar official can successfully evolve to meet the complex moral and economic expectations of a modern, highly educated populace, or if the intense, costly pressures of meritocracy will continue to create the very social instability they were originally designed to prevent.